start with 5 names. Spain, the reigning world champions, the team that just lifted the trophy. France, England, Germany, Italy. 5 of the biggest, richest, most decorated football nations on the entire planet. And every one of them has just told FIFA the same thing. We will not be showing up to the 2030 World Cup. Not a threat. And here's the part that should make Gianni Infantino feel sick to his stomach. Those 5 names, that's not the list. That's 5 names off a list of 55. Because it isn't 5 countries walking away from the World Cup. It's all of Europe. Every single UEFA nation, unanimously, in one room, raising one hand. So, what on earth did FIFA say to make the most powerful confederation in world football decide the World Cup itself wasn't worth attending? Let me walk you through it, because it's somehow even worse than it sounds. On Tuesday, Infantino unveiled a plan. Not a whisper, not a leak, a formal proposal. FIFA wants to take its crown jewels, the World Cup, and every other tournament it owns, and spin the commercial rights off into a brand new company called FIFA Forward Enterprise. And then it wants to sell a chunk of that company, roughly 20%, to private investors in a deal valued at around $20 billion. FIFA wants to sell a piece of the World Cup to private equity. And it gets richer because the investor lined up to lead the whole thing is a fund connected to Joshua Kushner, the founder of Thrive Capital. If that surname rings a bell, it should. Joshua is the brother of Jared Kushner, who happens to be the son-in-law of the President of the United States. So, the most watched sporting event on Earth, an event built over nearly a century by players and fans on every continent, would have a slice of it owned by a private investment fund with ties to the White House. Now, FIFA didn't frame it as a fire sale. Of course, it didn't. Infantino sold it as generosity. Vote this through, he told FIFA's 211 member associations, and the money comes flooding back to you. FIFA claims each association could pull in more than $80 million over the next decade, with development funding for the smaller nations climbing sharply. And to make sure nobody had too much time to think about it, he attached a deadline, September 19th, a little over 6 weeks to hand over a piece of the World Cup forever. Reportedly, he didn't consult the confederations first. He just announced it. And that, more than the money, more than the Kushner connection, more than anything, is what lit the fuse. Because if there is one thing football's governing bodies do not respond well to, it's being handed a decision that's already been made and told to rubber stamp it before the deadline. UEFA moved first, and UEFA moved hard. On Thursday, European football's governing body called an emergency virtual meeting of all 55 of its member associations. Sources say more than 50 of them took the floor, and by the end of it, the vote was unanimous. They would boycott not just the 2030 World Cup, but every FIFA competition for as long as this proposal stays alive. And they demanded not just that it be dropped, but that FIFA promise in binding terms to never open its competitions to private ownership again. The World Cup cannot be treated as an investment product, UEFA said in its statement. To Infantino, the World Cup is an asset, something with a valuation. To the people who actually play it and watch it, it is not for sale. It was never for sale. CONCACAF, the confederation covering North and Central America and the Caribbean, 41 members, including the co-hosts of the World Cup being played right now, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, held its own emergency meeting and rejected the plan outright. They didn't announce a boycott, but they tore into the process, the lack of due process, the artificially short deadline, the total absence of proper governance. The U.S. Soccer Federation publicly lined up behind them. Then, Asia followed. The AFC, 47 members, a group that has historically been a reliable bedrock of support for Infantino, released its own statement, standing in solidarity with UEFA and CONCACAF, and demanding an urgent review of how FIFA even makes decisions like this. 55 European associations, 41 from CONCACAF, 47 from Asia. That's 143 of FIFA's 211 members now standing against the plan. And Infantino needs a majority to pass it. Then came the resignations. Carlos Cordero, a senior advisor to Infantino and FIFA's own representative on the White House task force for the 2026 World Cup, stepped down in protest and called on other senior staff to speak out, too. A genuine challenger emerging against Infantino at next spring's FIFA presidential election, a race everyone assumed he'd walk unopposed. Here's what this really comes down to. The World Cup does not belong to Gianni Infantino. And it certainly doesn't belong to a private equity fund. It belongs to the fans who paint their faces, the tiny nations who fight for years just to qualify, the players who give everything on the field. FIFA is supposed to be the caretaker. This week, the caretaker tried to sell the house, and every other person living in it stood up at once and said no. Infantino gambled that his 211 members would take the money and stay quiet. Instead, more than 140 of them lined up to call his bluff. His own advisors are walking out the door and the plan looks dead before it ever reached a vote. Whether he pulls it, digs in, or tries to survive the fallout is the story we'll all be watching next. So, I'll leave it with you. Was this a serious plan that FIFA badly misjudged? Or the biggest own goal in the history of football politics? Get into it in the comments. I want to hear which side you land on. And if you want to be here when that September deadline hits and we find out whether Infantino blinks, subscribe and stick with us because this one is nowhere near finished.